Early morning of August 7, 1990. The U.S. 82nd Airborne Division's 2,300 soldiers have assembled. They boarded C-130 transport aircraft departing from North Carolina for Saudi Arabia, kicking off Operation Desert Shield. After 5 months of intense sea and air transport, by early January, the total U.S. forces arriving in the Gulf region reached 527,000 personnel, of which 195,000 were Army, 94,000 were Marines, 82,000 were Navy, and 56,000 were Air Force. They deployed 2,200 tanks, 2,000 armored vehicles, and 2,800 aircraft. With combined forces from over 30 other countries, the total force exceeded 700,000 personnel. Such a massive force had a single objective: to drive Saddam out of Kuwait. Welcome to Intrigue and Might, focusing on famous battles. Today we discuss Phase 1 of the Gulf War. Operation Desert Shield. To understand why Saddam was targeted by the multinational coalition, we need to turn the timeline back a bit. 1988, the ceasefire agreement signed by President Saddam ended the bloody 8-year war with Iran. Iraq suffered 600,000 casualties and not only made no progress on the battlefield, but also accumulated enormous debts. External debt alone amounted to $80 billion, and rebuilding destroyed areas would cost another $230 billion for Iraq's already weak economy. It was a devastating blow. Even worse, international oil prices remained low, and Iraq was counting on oil exports for revenue. The government finances were in shambles. This posed a serious threat to Saddam's authoritarian rule. His million-man army was the fourth largest in the world, with annual military spending accounting for 40% of GDP. If the Iraqi government could no longer afford to maintain its army, then Saddam would be unable to sustain his violent regime. Facing this predicament, Saddam turned his gaze toward his smaller neighbor. May 1990. In Baghdad, the capital of Iraq, Saddam met with his neighbor, Kuwait's head of state, Jaber al-Sabah. Jaber, who ruled one of the wealthiest countries on earth. Although Kuwait was a small Middle Eastern country, its oil reserves accounted for 10% of the world's oil. Facing domestic difficulties, Saddam blamed Kuwait for his troubles, accusing them of deliberately lowering oil prices to flood the market with cheap oil, an action that was accelerating Iraq's descent into economic crisis. Later that day, Saddam issued a stern warning to Jaber, saying that for every $1 drop in oil prices, Iraq's annual revenue would decrease by $1 billion. If you don't want us to go to war with Iraq, please stop. But in fact, during the Iran-Iraq War, Kuwait had been carefully assisting Iraq. They provided $1.5 billion to the Iraqis for purchasing arms and allowed Iraq to use a small military airbase in Kuwait. These measures were merely intended to curry favor, to keep Iraq from harassing them. But little did they know, their generosity only fanned the flames, igniting Saddam's flames of ambition even more fiercely. This time, Kuwait refused to continue swallowing its pride. In response to Saddam's demands, Jaber did not give much in return, taking a hard line. 1 month later, Saddam's inner circle decided that unless Kuwait handed over $10 billion to Iraq, Iraq would immediately invade. For Saddam, after the Iran-Iraq War, the only thing left for him was an army tempered in combat, a fearsome army. What he needed to do was to find a suitable target for this force, to divert the public's attention abroad. This was a common tactic of many rulers here. Saddam employed it as well. Under his incitement, Iraqis truly believed that their hardships were caused by the Kuwaitis. Many in Baghdad took to the streets, demanding Saddam punish Kuwait. According to then Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz's recollection, invading Kuwait was Iraq's only option at the time.
Iraq had no choice but to act, either to be destroyed, to be suffocated and strangled inside its territory, or attack the enemy on the outside.
July 1990. The Republican Guard clearly advanced south toward the border. These were elite divisions of the Iraqi army, equipped with Soviet tanks, in the Middle East. Apart from Israel, other country had the power to match them. Meanwhile, U.S. spy satellites also, for the first time in the Gulf, photographed this military movement. Satellite images showed Iraq was massing troops on the southern border, but this action did not immediately attract American attention because Iraq was moving troops within its own territory and lacked matching logistical support. No large-scale communications network was set up either, and there was no direct evidence showing that Iraq was about to start a war. Americans believed that to deal with a small country like Kuwait, a police force would suffice. There was no need for full military mobilization. Saddam was merely flexing his muscles, but other Middle Eastern countries were not as optimistic as the Americans. After all, these troops were right at their doorstep. After all, these troops were genuinely stationed right at their doorstep. Soon, Iraq massed 30,000 men on the Kuwait border, and the crisis quickly intensified. Egypt's Mubarak urgently rushed to Baghdad to arrange talks for the Arab world and Iraq. Mubarak was one of America's closest allies in the region. He was determined to find out what Saddam was up to.
I met with Saddam Hussein. He met me in the airport. Then he took me in the car. He was driving, this beside him, nobody with us. Until we went to one of the palaces near the lake there. And we went upstairs to the first floor, tete-a-tete, in a big room. And we were both alone, nobody with us. I asked him about what the problem, what's happening. I told, do you have any intention to attack them, invade them? He told me, no, but don't tell the Kuwaits about it. It was a very clear answer.
This meeting had far-reaching consequences. As soon as the Egyptian president left Baghdad, he immediately called the White House, saying Saddam was bluffing. Mubarak told President Bush Sr. that the Iraqis just wanted money and Saddam was showing off his military might. He advised the U.S. not to intervene, that the Arab world would resolve it internally. However, the day after Mubarak left, Saddam summoned the U.S. ambassador to Iraq to test America's attitude on the issue. The answer greatly pleased Saddam. Ambassador April Glaspie repeated the State Department's position.
This was hardly tantamount to a warning shot across the bow. She said, we're watching you, we're concerned about the bellicose statements that you've been issuing. But our fundamental feeling is that we have no direct vested interest in Arab-Arab disputes, including the dispute that you're having with the Kuwaitis over the mutual border that you share.
After the meeting, Saddam announced his decision. He would hold further talks with the Kuwaitis. Glaspie promptly informed Washington that during the meeting, Saddam himself seemed a bit flustered, unsure how to conclude things. Now it was deemed appropriate to reduce public criticism of Iraq and avoid overreacting. This information quickly reached President Bush Sr. At this point, after discussions in the White House, it was unanimously believed that although the crisis hadn't passed, it had essentially peaked. However, at the same time, Iraq was accelerating the deployment of troops to the border, increasing from the initial 30,000 to 100,000. Yet even so, Arab leaders still believed that Saddam was merely bluffing and would not dare to launch a war recklessly. As time passed, Saddam's imposed deadline soon arrived. August 1, 1990, Kuwait proposed that it could pay $500 million to Iraq as compensation, but Saddam's $10 billion demand was far off. That afternoon, Iraq began gathering troops to launch an attack on Kuwait. At the same time, U.S. spy satellites showed bases once packed with hundreds of Iraqi tanks were now empty, and armed helicopters had been pulled off the tarmac. There was no doubt that the Republican Guard had already mobilized. Upon receiving this news, the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency immediately issued a Level 1 alert. At this point, the Americans finally understood that Saddam was not putting on a show. He truly intended to invade Kuwait. With matters at this point, White House officials began counseling the president on how to prevent the outbreak of war at the last moment, rather than prepare to strike Saddam and urge him to reconsider. However, at that very moment, news from Kuwait reached the White House that Kuwait had already been bombed. The war had already begun.